This is Michael Lewis from Unit 5, and I'm going to talk to you guys about mapping today. So mapping is something that I think all the units are looking at, and hopefully this will relate in some ways to David Lem's talk, which you guys will either watch before or after this, but is another kind of way of mapping that we're going to be looking at in our unit that I think hopefully is interesting to everyone. So to begin with this classic map that you guys all will know, hopefully from the history of architecture, which is this Noli plan of Rome, right? Which looks at this relationship between publicly accessible space and private space. Incredibly important early map in terms of understanding the city, in terms of understanding how we would relate to urbanity kind of for a long time. But as mapping has evolved, new techniques have arisen which begin to reveal more complicated information, more poetic information, and the kind of tools that we're asking you guys to engage with and to question are ways of thinking about maps that go beyond, a traditional notion of a map as a static device, which is kind of non-narrative or somehow an authority. Maps have agendas, and the more specific maps can be about their agendas and more clear-headed they can be, the more powerful those messages can be and more revealing. So here we're looking at this map of Philadelphia by Louis Kahn, where again we get this sense of urban scale and the relationship between what is sort of accessible space and what is not accessible space, but we understand it through the kind of negation of the urban block. The block becomes present through its absence. And what we see instead are flows of traffic. And so through this very specific lens, we can begin to understand the city in terms of rhythms. So we can understand where densities occur, we can understand where flow occurs, where directionality happens, and even we can begin to get some sense of topography or scale. So the notations which denote parking structures and how we begin to move up through the city. So suddenly through this static drawing, there begins to be a sense of scale in that we understand a beginning hint at the verticality of a city. And then, as we begin to look at other types of mapping, we see something which breaks down completely the kind of notion of the block and begins to look much more explicitly at relationality. So this kind of Dadaist map of Paris in which we understand how the city becomes a fragmented thing that we understand by proximities or by relationships. So if you imagine getting onto a tube in London and getting off at another station, you've kind of bypassed a huge part of the city there, and your experience of the city is more about nodes. And this map begins to speak this truth about how we experience cities, not as these kind of static forms, but as these kind of highly dynamic relationships. This is a map by Harold Fiske, who worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. And in the kind of 1940s, he conducted this survey of the Mississippi River. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at a drawing of time. This drawing is based on a series of soil samples which traced the maneuvering or the movement of the Mississippi River across the alluvial plains of the American Midwest. And so, if you imagine a garden hose which has been put on full blast and laid down on the ground, it kind of snakes all over the place. And this is what historically the Mississippi River used to do before it was controlled. And so what we see in this map is we see the kind of meandering across a landscape. And there's a poetic beauty, a graphic beauty to this map. And yet what it is just a highly specific and highly scientific approach to looking at mapping. So there's this interesting balance between again, specificity and poetics, which I think we're all interested in and looking at when we talk about maps. Now, again, looking at the kind of data-driven side of maps, what we're looking at here is part of Nicholas Feltron's annual report for, I can't remember what year, but for a period of years, Nicholas Feltron, who's a designer, conducted these series of studies of examining his life. So this is kind of a lot of the digital tools now that kind of quantify our lived experience. And he kept these meticulous notebooks which tracked his activity. And through compiling these notebooks and beginning to overlay them on maps, he could reveal truths and patterns in his lived experience, which start to tell a story about his engagement with urban space. So there's something interesting here about the collection of data and then the display of data. And they're extremely beautiful pieces as well. So this is just kind of a reference for you guys to kind of check out. Another very important series of maps were the works of Dennis Wood, who's a cartographer who has worked across kind of landscape architecture and cartography, traditional cartography, since the kind of 70s, someone who challenges dramatically the notion of mapping as something which is non-narrative and is interested explicitly in the kind of agenda of maps. So he conducted this series of maps, which were of his neighborhood in North Carolina, which is called Boylan Heights. And through this body of maps, we begin to get a very complete picture of this particular neighborhood. And what makes the maps so interesting is that they each kind of deal with something quite specific, and those specific things reveal heightened awareness around a particular phenomena or a particular condition. So in this map, for example, we're looking at traffic notations. And by distilling all the traffic notations, one, we get a survey of the neighborhood. But we can begin to, again, as with the Louis Kahn map, understand junctions of particular density, depending upon what type of signage is there and how much signage is there, and also how traffic moves through space. We can understand where the predominant vehicular traffic is through this neighborhood, and we can also begin to get an understanding of the kind of grid of how the neighborhood is laid out. This is another map which describes the amount of police calls. So again, we can begin to tell stories about what this might mean in terms of visibility, in terms of who lives in these neighborhoods, in terms of where people are concentrated. This is a map of the pools of light. So again, this begins to tell a story about how there are cycles within a neighborhood, right? There's the day-night cycle, and this begins to reveal some nature of visibility, and also how urban space changes according to the diurnal patterns. This map he titles Squirrel Highways, and what it is a map of telephone lines that trace through the neighborhood. And so, again, what this map does is it begins to reveal the notion of layering within a city, so that there are different ways in which different things move around the city. Humans move on a different plane from this drawing that we're looking at. So we start thinking about a user who is outside of the kind of human experience, and there's this kind of dual narrative to this map. It's about communication and the kind of the hard wiring of telecommunications, and similarly it is about routes of access by specific types of animals, or indeed resting places for birds, and also it begins to reveal where houses are. This map is a map of the jack-o'-lanterns within the community. And I would invite you all to listen to the This American Life podcast episode on mapping, which is quite a few years ago now, but it's available on their archive. And there's a really nice story about this particular map, which is worth listening to. That whole episode on mapping is quite interesting as well. And there's also a nice Radiolab podcast about cities, which talks about mapping in an interesting way, which I would invite you guys to listen to as you work. This map is looking at roof pitches. So again, we start to understand where buildings are in relationship to one another, but we also start to get this other story about how water moves through the site. So we can see how these buildings shed. We see how the kind of volumetric, or we can infer the volumetric nature of the neighborhood, and we can also understand how rainwater is diverted. This mapping project is by Tim Knowles, which is a series of tree drawings, and what he's mapping here is wind. So we see how over time the pressure from these ink pens on this paper moves according to subtle variations within the wind. And so this becomes, kind of an elegant way of drawing a natural process. And the kind of infrastructure of this drawing is kind of as beautiful, as important as the work itself. So something to think about is how you design the means for recording the thing that you're interested in looking at and photographing that process to reveal how you're working. This is another project by Tim Knowles, which is called Windwalk, and it's about a certain deauthoring of mapping. And so he created this device. Again, it's about this kind of design of an architecture or the design of a device to guide in or to determine to some extent the way in which we navigate space. So by deauthoring the way that he's moving around space, he's inviting himself to engage in space in a new way. So if you think about how we normally will walk through a city and we kind of operate on these automatic routines, and you're not really necessarily thinking about space, the space that you're engaging with. If you think about moving into a new city, or if you think about moving with a grandparent or a young child, you start navigating urban space in a very different way. And in doing so, you get a completely different reading of that. So if you're walking with someone who's elderly, perhaps you're walking much slower and you're paying much more attention to specific textural qualities, or you're seeing buildings that you haven't seen before. If you're in an unfamiliar terrain, similarly, you're looking at the city in a new way. So here we have a map of that wind walk in which we can see the kind of meandering path that Tim took through this landscape. And the landscape itself becomes somewhat secondary to the kind of mode of moving. Right? There's a certain irrationality in some way to this movement, and yet there's something kind of very free and loose and playful about it, which is perhaps liberating. This is another project by Tim Knowles called Vehicle Motion Drawings, in which he constructed a device which rode in the back of his car, and the exhibition that it was arriving at was an exhibition of the actual process of getting there. So what we're looking at here is an installation view at a gallery in Switzerland. So Tim drove from the UK to Switzerland, and the work became the documentation of that process. So it's this long drawing, which we see pinned up on the wall, which is the output of this mapping. So again, there's something here about that interface between the mode of recording and then the kind of output of that recording. And there's a dialogue between these things, which starts to tell a story. So this map is a drawing by Richard Long in the landscape. And again, this relates back to Tim Knowles' project of the Windwalk in terms of how it is that we experience space. So if you think about Richard walking this line, there's a deliberateness to this act. And we can infer from the kind of tracing of this that this took repeated walks, right? So he's traversing a set distance over time, over a period of repetitions. And what that does is it begins to carve into the landscape. Now we know this is going to be transient, and this will disappear. So there's something here again about the relationship of time and space and mapping, which becomes quite interesting, which we see reflected perhaps more explicitly in this work by Richard Long, in which we see a series of concentric circles, which were all walks, all maps of walks, and each walk was conducted in a day. So the inner circle obviously would have been walked much slower than the outer circle, because he has to cover more distance. And so when we look at that in conjunction with the topography of space, we can begin to understand how through the kind of speed that we engage with space, we read this space differently. Okay, so again, introducing the kind of temporal aspects into map making begins to reveal a story that is narrative, more explicitly narrative than we might traditionally think of map making. This is a different kind of map making. This is a project by Knoll in which they took a series of latex castings of space, and these become kind of one-to-one mappings of textures, of material qualities of a space. And then the kind of presentation of them becomes about the juxtaposition of them within a new context. So there's something here about remoteness, or there's something here about this notion of like an outpost of transmuting one space into another, and how that space gets staged in a new space begins to create a dialogue of some kind, and also how the things themselves are held within any particular space. So whether they're laid on the floor, or whether they are hung from the ceiling, whether they are occupy a corner, etc., how we move around a thing in relationship to another thing begins to tell a story and situates a map within a space. So this is something for you guys to think about in terms of model making, or in terms of the occupation of digital space, in terms of how you put things in conjunction with other things. And through that juxtaposition, you begin to tell a story. And the more specific you can be about that story, the more powerful your map can be. Here we start to see a kind of library of conditions, or a library of textures. And these things, what's interesting about these things in one way is how they begin to pick up the kind of detritus, or the residue of the place where they were. So the latex as a material starts to get perverted somehow as it begins to hold these other kind of contaminants, perhaps, and tell these stories of age, of decay, of use, etc. And again, just looking at and thinking about how that thing is kind of held within a space, or how indeed it begins to define and describe new spaces, new means of movement. I'm just going to quickly go through these works by Jereen DeVoit, whose work is kind of an active exploration of mapping in a lot of different ways. There are these kind of narrative maps, which she describes quite nicely as combined line and text to diagram both factual and fictive activities, such as the flight of eagles, geographical directions, wind patterns, rotations, shifting horizon lines, top 10 pop charts, kisses, and electrical currents. So what is so beautiful about Jereen DeVoit's mappings are this combination between looseness and specificity. So there's a rigorous mode of notation that exists in all of her maps, which kind of ground them. And then there is a kind of freedom in line work, which holds movement, and which becomes evocative and sensual. And so here, for example, we're looking at this kind of movement of wind. And we can see how wind begins to hold shape to one extent or another. This map is a mapping of a sonata by Beethoven. And we can see, again, how she's developing her own language for how a map gets constructed, and there's a a kind of a rigorous logic, and that logic to some extent might be impenetrable, but yet we kind of believe it because it's so clearly articulated, right? So it tells a story. Now I'm not her; I can't tell the explicit story, but her website is a wonderful repository, and I really encourage anyone who's interested in these maps to look out more, because she speaks about them very eloquently. But just to kind of show, I suppose, the kind of that power and that relationship between how and when you're specific and how and when you're loose. I think these drawings do a kind of a beautiful job of that. And then here she begins to bring in texture in addition to those kind of those line drawings. So the last project I'm going to show you guys is Holly Rumble's Hear a Pin Drop. So this project is a sound art project by Holly Rumble, the Glaswegian or Glasgow-based artist. And what this project is looking at is where in any kind of given location you can hear a pin drop. And it's a kind of group exercise piece in which participants are invited to navigate in a space, usually an urban space, drop a pin from roughly eye height and see if you can hear it drop. And then there become a series of photographic outputs of where this kind of end was achieved, and then maps based upon those kind of shared resources. So what we start to get is an acoustic mapping of a city in which we can identify particular material conditions and also specific sonic conditions. And so if you imagine, dropping a pin in Waverley Station as the trains come in, obviously you're not going to hear that. If you imagine dropping a pin on the path in the meadows as opposed to on the grass in the meadows, you're going to get a different result. If you drop it on metal versus dropping it on wood versus dropping it on concrete, you're going to get a different acoustic result. If you drop it when it's wet versus when it's dry, you're going to get a different acoustic result. All of these things become, again, a prompt and a way of navigating the city, which is revealing in some way, in the sense that we move through the city by a new mode. It's inviting us to engage with space in a way that begins to reveal characteristics of that space that we might otherwise not be paying attention to. And so in our unit, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create maps that look at and talk about space in very specific ways and have a very specific narrative agenda. And what that agenda does is it begins to give us a basis for which we can create architectural speculations. So this kind of narrative in mapping shapes a way of thinking about and looking at space. And through the specificity of what those maps reveal, we can begin designing responses which either work to that experience or work against that experience. And so what I've tried to do here is just show you guys a bunch of different ways that mapping gets done in order to communicate that, the sort of narrative way that we're trying to think about space. I hope that this has been interesting, and I look forward to seeing the beautiful maps that all of you units create. And yeah, thanks so much. That's it.